I never thought kindness could be weaponized against me. Looking back now, 18 months later, I realized that the woman who lived in our guest room for free wasn't just taking advantage of our generosity. She was systematically dismantling my marriage from the inside out. My name is Catherine, and this is the story of how I discovered the most painful betrayal of my life and somehow found the strength to rebuild everything I thought I had lost. It started with what I believed was compassion. Rebecca had been working at the same marketing firm as my husband David for about 6 months when she mentioned during a company barbecue that she was struggling to find affordable housing in our expensive city. She was 26, newly divorced, and trying to get back on her feet after what she described as an abusive relationship. Her story tugged at my heartstrings in a way that I now recognize as masterfully crafted manipulation. David came home that evening with that earnest expression he wore whenever he wanted to discuss something important. We were sitting in our kitchen, the same kitchen where I would later confront him about his infidelity, and he presented Rebecca's situation as if it were a mathematical equation with an obvious solution. "Kat, you know how we've always talked about using the guest room to help someone in need?" he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of righteousness that I had once found endearing. "Rebecca really needs a place to stay, just temporarily, until she can get back on her feet. She's been couch surfing for weeks." I remember feeling a surge of pride in that moment. Pride in my husband for caring about us, a colleague. Pride in our ability to help someone less fortunate. Pride in the life we had built together that allowed us such generosity. Our guest room had been sitting empty for months, perfectly furnished but rarely used except for the occasional visit from my parents or David's sister. "Of course," I said without hesitation. "How long does she think she'll need to stay?" "Just a few months, maybe less. She's looking for her own place, but you know how crazy the rental market is right now." "A few months?" That was March. By November, Rebecca had not only made herself completely at home in our space, but she had also made herself completely at home in my husband's heart. The first few weeks were actually pleasant. Rebecca was charming, helpful, and seemingly grateful for our assistance. She would cook elaborate dinners as a way of saying thank you, always insisting that she wanted to contribute something to the household. She had a way of making everyone around her feel special, important, seen. I now understand that this was her particular talent, the ability to make people feel like they were the most fascinating person in the world while she studied them, learned their weaknesses, and figured out exactly how to exploit them. She would spend hours asking me about my work as a freelance graphic designer, showing genuine interest in my projects, and offering thoughtful suggestions. She remembered details about my clients, asked follow-up questions about deadlines, and even helped me organize my home office when I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the chaos of papers and sample prints. "You're so talented, Catherine," she would say, examining my latest logo design or marketing brochure. "I don't know how you come up with these ideas. David is so lucky to have someone so creative and accomplished." The compliments felt genuine. Her admiration seemed real, and I found myself looking forward to our evening conversations. She had a way of making me feel like my work mattered, like my contributions to our household went beyond just splitting the mortgage and utilities with David. But while she was building this friendship with me, she was constructing something entirely different with my husband. I started noticing small changes in David's behavior sometime around May. He began working later, staying at the office for what he called important projects that required his immediate attention. He became more interested in his appearance, spending extra time in the bathroom each morning, and asking my opinion about shirts and cologne in a way that felt slightly performative. "You look nice," I would tell him, and he would smile in a way that seemed almost secretive. as if he were holding on to some private joke. He also became more attentive to me, which I initially interpreted as a positive development in our 7-year marriage. He would bring me flowers without occasion, suggest spontaneous dinner dates, and compliment my appearance with an enthusiasm that felt both flattering and slightly out of character. "You're beautiful, Kat," he would say, pulling me close while we watched television. "I hope you know how much I love you." I now realize that this heightened attention was his way of managing his own guilt, of convincing himself that he could maintain both relationships without destroying either one. He was trying to love 2 women simultaneously, and the extra effort he was putting into our marriage was his attempt to balance the scales of his own betrayal. Rebecca, meanwhile, had settled into our home with the ease of someone who had always belonged there. She learned our routines, our preferences, our small domestic rituals, and began participating in them as if she were a natural part of our family unit. She would have coffee ready when David came downstairs each morning, always prepared exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, served in the blue ceramic mug that had been his favorite since college. She started joining us for our Sunday morning walks around the neighborhood, a tradition that David and I had maintained for years as our way of connecting and planning for the week ahead. Her presence transformed these intimate conversations into group discussions, and while she was always pleasant and engaging, I began to miss the private time with my husband. "Rebecca really adds something to our dynamic, doesn't she?" David would say after these walks. And I would agree, though I couldn't quite articulate what exactly she was adding, or why it felt like something essential was simultaneously being subtracted. The summer passed in a blur of barbecues, beach trips, and long evenings on our back patio, the 3 of us sharing bottles of wine and talking about everything from politics to philosophy to our dreams for the future. Rebecca had extended her stay with us, explaining that the rental market was still impossible and that she was saving money for a larger security deposit. We agreed to let her stay through the fall, with the understanding that she would be out by Christmas. She had become such an integral part of our daily lives that the idea of her leaving felt strangely unsettling. She knew how I took my coffee, remembered my client deadlines, and would often have dinner started before David and I even got home from work. She had transformed our house into something that felt more alive, more vibrant, more social than it had been in years. But underneath this surface harmony, something was fundamentally shifting in my marriage. David and I were talking less, touching less, sharing fewer of those small, intimate moments that had always been the foundation of our relationship. Our conversations became more practical, focused on schedules and responsibilities rather than hopes and dreams. I attributed this distance to the natural evolution of a long-term relationship, the way couples sometimes drift slightly apart before finding their way back to each other. I thought we were just going through a phase, that having a house guest was naturally creating some tension that would resolve itself once Rebecca found her own place. I was spectacularly wrong. The discovery came on a Tuesday in early November. I had been feeling unwell that morning, a persistent headache and nausea that I initially attributed to stress from a particularly demanding client project. I decided to work from home, something I rarely did since my home office was in the same room where Rebecca often spent her days looking for apartments and applying for jobs. I told David I was staying home, but I forgot to mention it to Rebecca. She left the house that morning at her usual time, presumably to meet with a potential landlord about a rental property she had been excited about. I spent the morning in bed, dozing fitfully, and hoping the headache would pass. Around noon, I heard David's key in the front door. This was unusual. He rarely came home during the day, and when he did, he always called or texted to let me know he was coming. I assumed he had forgotten something important for work, so I stayed in bed, planning to call out to him once I heard him moving around the house. But then I heard Rebecca's voice, low and intimate, coming from the direction of the guest room. My first thought was confusion. I had seen her leave that morning, and she hadn't mentioned coming back. My second thought was concern. Maybe she was sick. Maybe David had come home to check on her. I got out of bed quietly, intending to see if anyone needed help. But as I moved toward the guest room, I heard sounds that made my blood turn to ice. There was no mistaking what I was hearing. The unmistakable rhythm of two people making love, punctuated by whispered words that were too intimate, too familiar, too passionate, to be anything other than what they were. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall for support, listening to my husband and our house guest having sex in the room that was 20 feet away from the bedroom where he slept beside me every night. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, followed by quiet conversation that I couldn't make out but whose tone conveyed a level of intimacy that made my stomach clench with recognition. I retreated to my bedroom and closed the door as quietly as possible, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape from my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process what I had just heard, trying to find some alternative explanation that would make sense of the situation. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe Rebecca had come home sick, and David was helping her with something. Maybe the sounds I heard were something else entirely. Some innocent explanation that my suspicious mind had misinterpreted. But even as I tried to convince myself of these possibilities, I knew the truth. I had heard my husband making love to another woman, and that woman was living in our house, eating our food, sleeping in our bed when we were out of town, and pretending to be my friend while she systematically destroyed my marriage. I heard them moving around the house about 30 minutes later, their voices casual and normal, as if they had just been having a business meeting rather than betraying the person who had opened her home to both of them. I heard David's car start and drive away, presumably taking him back to work where he would spend the rest of the day acting as if nothing had happened. Rebecca left the house shortly after that, and I was alone with the knowledge that my life had just been completely upended. I spent the rest of that day in a state of shock, cycling through disbelief, anger, and a grief so profound it felt like physical pain. I kept thinking about all the signs I had missed, all the moments when I had sensed something was wrong, but had dismissed my instincts in favor of trust and optimism. The extra attention David had been paying to me wasn't love. It was guilt. The way Rebecca had been so interested in my work, so helpful around the house, so eager to be included in our lives, wasn't friendship. It was strategy. She had been studying me, learning my weaknesses, figuring out exactly how to position herself as everything I wasn't. Where I was sometimes scattered and overwhelmed with work, she was organized and available. Where I was comfortable and familiar, she was exciting and new. Where I was secure in my relationship and therefore perhaps less attentive to my husband's needs, she was focused entirely on making him feel special, desired, important. I realized that I had been competing in a game I didn't even know I was playing, and I had been losing for months. When David came home that evening, I was sitting in our living room, waiting for him, with a calmness that surprised me. The shock had given way to a clarity that felt almost transcendent. I knew exactly what had happened, exactly what I needed to do, and exactly how I was going to handle the situation. "We need to talk," I said when he walked through the door, still carrying his briefcase and wearing the same clothes I had heard him removing in the guest room 6 hours earlier. "About what?" he asked, but something in his expression told me he already knew. "About you and Rebecca." The color drained from his face in a way that would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so devastating. He stood there for a moment. clearly trying to decide whether to deny everything or admit to whatever portion of the truth seemed safest. "Kat, I heard you," I said simply. "Today, in the guest room. I was homesick, and I heard you having sex with our house guest." He sat down heavily on the couch across from me, his briefcase hitting the floor with a thud that seemed to echo in the silence that followed my words. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I watched him process the fact that his secret was out, that the careful compartmentalization of his life had just collapsed. "How long?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Kat, please, let me explain." "How long, David?" He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. A mixture of shame, fear, and something that might have been relief. 2 months, he said quietly. It started in September. 2 months. While I had been worrying about minor changes in his behavior, while I had been attributing our growing distance to normal relationship fluctuations, while I had been welcoming Rebecca into our home and treating her like family, they had been carrying on an affair under my roof. "Do you love her?" I asked, surprised by my own curiosity about the answer. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. "I don't know," he finally said. "I think I might." That honesty, brutal as it was, somehow hurt less than a lie would have. At least he wasn't trying to minimize what had happened, or convince me that it was just physical. At least he was admitting that my instincts had been correct. Something fundamental had changed in our marriage, and it wasn't something that could be easily fixed. "She has to leave," I said. "Tonight." "Kat, please." "She has to leave tonight, David. I will not spend another night in this house with the woman who has been sleeping with my husband." He nodded, understanding that this was not a negotiation. "I'll talk to her." "No," I said. "I will talk to her. This is my house too, and I will be the one to tell her to leave." I had never felt more powerful or more devastated in my life. I was claiming my space, asserting my rights, protecting my dignity, and simultaneously watching my marriage crumble in real time. But there was something liberating about finally knowing the truth, about no longer having to wonder why I felt so disconnected from the man I had pledged to love forever. When Rebecca came home that evening, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. She walked in with that same bright smile she had been wearing for months, completely unaware that her secret had been discovered. "Hey, Catherine, how are you feeling? David mentioned you were sick today." The casual mention of her conversation with my husband about my health made my stomach turn. They had been discussing me, sharing details about my life, treating my existence as a minor obstacle to their relationship. "I'm fine," I said, "but we need to talk." Something in my tone must have warned her, because her smile faded and she became very still. "Okay," she said carefully. "I know about you and David." She didn't try to deny it, which I respected. She simply nodded and said, "I'm sorry. Are you?" I asked. "Because this has been going on for months, and you've been living in my house, eating my food, and pretending to be my friend while you've been sleeping with my husband. So, I'm curious about what exactly you're sorry for." She looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time since I had known her. I never meant for it to happen. But it did happen, and it kept happening, and you had opportunities every single day to stop it, or to leave, or to tell me the truth, and you chose to continue the deception. "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't have an excuse. I want you out of my house tonight. Catherine, I understand that you're angry, but I don't have anywhere else to go. I've been looking for a place, but that's not my problem anymore," I said, my voice harder than I had ever heard it. "You should have thought about that before you decided to have an affair with my husband in my guest room." She stared at me for a moment, and I saw something flicker across her face. Maybe surprise at my strength, Maybe respect for my directness. Maybe just calculation, as she tried to figure out her next move. "Can I have until tomorrow morning?" she asked. "No. I want you gone tonight. Pack your things and leave." "Catherine, please." "You have 2 hours," I said. "If you're not gone by then, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing." She nodded and went to the guest room to pack her belongings. I listened to her moving around, opening drawers and closets, gathering the possessions she had accumulated during her months in our home. David stayed in our bedroom, presumably giving her space to pack and me space to process what was happening. When she left, she didn't say goodbye. She simply walked out the front door with her suitcase and a few boxes, and I watched from the window as she loaded everything into her car and drove away. I felt a tremendous sense of relief, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. That night, David and I had the most honest conversation of our 7-year marriage. He told me that he had been feeling disconnected from me for months before Rebecca arrived, that he had been questioning whether we were still compatible, whether we still wanted the same things from life. He said that Rebecca had made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years, that she had reminded him of who he used to be before he became settled and comfortable, and maybe a little bit bored. I told him that I had been feeling the same distance, but had attributed it to normal relationship evolution rather than fundamental incompatibility. I said that I had been taking our marriage for granted, assuming that our love was strong enough to weather any temporary disconnection without requiring active effort to maintain it. We talked about whether our marriage was worth saving, whether we could rebuild trust, whether we could find our way back to each other after such a profound betrayal. We talked until sunrise, crying and arguing and trying to figure out if we still loved each other enough to do the difficult work of repair. In the end, we decided to try. The next few months were the hardest of my life. David ended his relationship with Rebecca, leaving his job to avoid continued contact with her. He started seeing a therapist individually and attending couples counseling with me. He answered every question I had about the affair, no matter how painful or embarrassing, and he gave me complete access to his phone, email, and social media accounts. I struggled with waves of anger, sadness, and doubt that would hit me at unexpected moments. I would find myself crying in the grocery store, remembering how Rebecca used to ask me to pick up her favorite yogurt. I would lie awake at night, wondering if David was thinking about her, if he missed her, if he regretted choosing me over her. But slowly, gradually, we began to rebuild something stronger than what we had before. The affair had forced us to confront problems in our marriage that we had been ignoring for years. We learned to communicate more directly, to express our needs more clearly, to prioritize our relationship in ways we had forgotten how to do. We also learned that we were more resilient than either of us had imagined. The betrayal had tested our commitment to each other in ways that nothing else could have, and we discovered that our love was deeper and more durable than we had given it credit for. David proved his commitment to our marriage through consistent actions over many months. He was patient with my anger, understanding of my doubt, and completely transparent about his whereabouts and activities. He rebuilt trust through reliability, rather than grand gestures, showing me every day that he was choosing me, choosing us, choosing the life we were building together. I learned that forgiveness is not a single decision, but a daily practice. There were days when I felt like I had moved past the betrayal, and days when the anger would return as fresh and painful as ever. But gradually, the good days began to outnumber the bad ones, and I found myself looking forward to our future together, rather than dwelling on the pain of the past. The guest room stood empty for months after Rebecca left. Neither of us could bring ourselves to enter it, let alone use it for anything meaningful. It became a monument to our pain, a reminder of how our generosity had been exploited and our trust had been betrayed. But eventually, we decided to reclaim that space. We repainted the walls, bought new furniture, and transformed it into a home office for me, a place where I could work on my graphic design projects without the distractions of the main living areas. It became a symbol of our renewal, a demonstration that we could take something that had been poisoned by betrayal and make it clean and useful again. I won't pretend that our marriage returned to exactly what it had been before the affair. The experience changed us both, individually and as a couple. We became more honest with each other, more intentional about our relationship, more aware of the ways that complacency can create vulnerabilities that others can exploit. We also became more selective about the people we invite into our lives. We learned that kindness without boundaries can become a form of self-destruction, that helping someone in need doesn't require exposing yourself to manipulation or abuse. Looking back now, I can see that Rebecca's presence in our lives revealed weaknesses in our marriage that might have eventually destroyed us anyway. The affair was devastating, but it was also a wake-up call that forced us to address problems we had been avoiding and to rebuild our relationship on a stronger foundation. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't discovered the affair that day. If David and Rebecca had been more careful, if their relationship had continued indefinitely while I remained oblivious. Would David have eventually left me for her? Would they have tired of each other once the thrill of secrecy was removed? Would I have spent years wondering why I felt so disconnected from my husband without ever understanding the real reason? I'm grateful that I discovered the truth when I did, painful as it was. The betrayal nearly destroyed me, but it also forced me to find strength I didn't know I possessed. It taught me that I could survive the worst thing I could imagine happening to my marriage, and that I could choose to rebuild rather than simply endure. David and I have been married for 9 years now, and I can honestly say that our relationship is stronger than it was before the affair. We've learned to see each other clearly, to communicate directly, and to prioritize our connection in ways that we hadn't before. We've also learned that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, but it requires consistent effort and complete honesty from both partners. The guest room is now my office, filled with my design work and art supplies. It's a space that represents my creativity, my independence, and my ability to transform something painful into something beautiful. Sometimes clients comment on how bright and welcoming it feels, and I smile, knowing that they're seeing the result of deliberate healing rather than accidental charm. We don't often talk about Rebecca anymore, but when we do, it's without the sharp pain that characterized those conversations for so long. She was a catalyst for change in our marriage, though certainly not in the way any of us intended. She taught us valuable lessons about trust, boundaries, and the importance of actively nurturing our relationship rather than taking it for granted. I've learned that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of love. Sometimes it can be the beginning of a deeper, more authentic connection, if both people are willing to do the difficult work of rebuilding. The affair was the worst thing that ever happened to our marriage, but it was also the beginning of the best version of our marriage. The woman who lived in our guest room for free thought she was taking something from me. In the end, she gave me something far more valuable. The knowledge that I am stronger than I ever imagined, that my marriage is worth fighting for, and that love, when it's real and when it's nurtured, can survive even the most devastating betrayals. I forgave my husband not because what he did was acceptable, but because I loved him enough to fight for our future together. I forgave him because I could see that he was genuinely remorseful, that he was willing to do whatever it took to rebuild our relationship, and that he had learned from his mistakes in ways that made him a better partner. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or pretending the affair never happened. It meant choosing to focus on who we were becoming, rather than who we had been. It meant believing that people can change, that marriages can heal, and that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most broken places. The guest room that once housed our betrayal now houses my dreams and ambitions. The marriage that was nearly destroyed by deception is now built on a foundation of radical honesty. The woman who once felt powerless in the face of manipulation now knows exactly what she will and won't tolerate in her relationships. I learned that kindness is still a virtue, but it must be paired with wisdom. I learned that trust is precious precisely because it is fragile. I learned that I am capable of surviving anything, of rebuilding from nothing, of choosing love even when love has hurt me. Most importantly, I learned that the end of one story can be the beginning of another, better story, if we have the courage to write it that way.